What I'd like to do now is really hand over to our first panel. I'd like to call Peter Elias from the University of Warwick, who will moderate the panel, Economic Value of Urban Data.
The way we've structured this morning, there's two panels. First panel is going to be talking about data. The second, more about research capacity and research initiatives. These two are inseparable, as I'm sure you all know. But we divide them up this way because they require different skills, different thinking, different policies, different experience, etc. And they have their own problem areas that we will be discussing this morning. I'm an economist by training, but for the last 15 years I've been working, I'm a member of the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures. I've been working with the European Commission, Research and Innovation, particularly on research infrastructure development, with the UK governments and the UK research councils on the particularly development of data infrastructure in the UK, and globally with the OECD and with other agencies like NSF, NIH, here in the US, and some of the foundations that fund infrastructure, Hewlett, Gates, etc., in the public health side. Now, this has given me quite a useful insight into some of the problems. And the one conclusion I've come to is that it's definitely the case that cities, understanding cities, is absolutely paramount to the way we're moving forward in society. I want to say a few words by way of setting the scene for the other three speakers that we have this morning. And of course, some of you are already very familiar with these ideas, but I just want to raise them because I think if we keep these in the back of our minds as this panel deliberates this morning, it will be useful. The first point to make is that we have to see cities as interconnected networks. And I've just set out a number of these networks. There are others that you could name. But the top three there, the first three bullet points, are very much physical infrastructure networks. Transportation, whether that's road, rail, metro, and that's a combination of both public and private types of networks. So if I decide to bring my car into Manhattan, that's a private decision. It's going to be regulated in many ways, but it's a private decision. If I hop onto the metro, that's public transport that I'm using. All of these things generate information through sensors, through systems, etc. And we have a lot of data generated from our transportation networks. Utility networks, absolutely essential, whether it's electricity, gas, water, telecoms, sewage, etc. All of these are the very essence of what powers our cities and what enables our cities to work in this way. Public hygiene networks, without one, would be engulfed in rubbish. We would pollute our waterways and our air and so on. So there's lots of network activity associated with what I've called here public hygiene. The other bullet points on here are more to do with ways in which we as city dwellers, city organisers, city policymakers and city residents interact with each other to make the city work. Urban planning, of course, zoning, these sorts of activities are essential. There's social and community networks. There's networks of people out there, networks who are interacting in terms of community, neighbourhood development, etc. We have to have security, and of course this is essential for our cities to exist in a safe and secure, to provide a safe and secure environment. And last but not least, which is the topic today, they are value-adding economic networks. Cities exist primarily because bringing together and concentrating economic activity into small spaces provides the ability to specialize, it provides the ability to divide up services in ways that just couldn't happen outside of a city environment. Now, as an economist, there are two things that we have to consider very carefully as we move forward to try to understand why cities exist, what they're doing, and how they operate. The first is the view of cities as providers of public goods. Now, this is a bit of a controversial area. Lots of economists say, well, there's really no such thing as a public good. Everything kind of private in one way or another. the idea of a public good is that it's there and that my consumption of it is not going to detract from your consumption. So street lighting is an obvious example. We all share it. Road systems, sort of, but of course they can become congested and crowded. Security, if it's provided there, is provided for all. But of course, again, by placing demands on security in one part of a city, you're removing it from another. So it's a mixed bag, but we have to remember the public good aspect of cities. Also, critically, we have to recognise the spillover effects, the interactions, the unintended consequences of actions in one area leading to outcomes in another. And these present big problems for the modelling of cities, trying to understand the public good aspect, trying to understand the spillover effects. My penultimate slide is to say, well, what are we trying to do? Simulating the city. Why? How? Well, the why, I think, is pretty obvious. If we can predict what we call the city stress points, where things might go wrong, where things are on a little bit of a knife edge, where with one push in a direction something catastrophic might happen, we have to be able to understand that. And I think Hurricane Sandy was a very good example here of trying to understand that knife edge, trying to understand what might happen in a worst-case scenario. But just a general understanding of the interconnectedness of these networks, I think, is vital to take forward the way in which we model the cities. What we're trying to do is to provide better services to city populations in a more efficient manner. So equity, efficiency, but with a kind of equilibrium built in, the 3 E's that economists are always stressing. That's important. Trying to do that for a city, I think, is a laudable goal indeed. And critically, we want to be able to regulate. Regulate with a small r, not to regulate with that heavy-handed approach to say you can't do this, you can't do that. Zoning is a very good example of what's really a heavy-handed approach to regulation. If we could understand better how this works, why we're doing what we're doing, what the outcomes are, we can develop better ways for regulation which are less obtrusive and more acceptable to our city populations. The how, that is the $64,000 question. Complex system modelling is clearly a part of what we must be doing here. I think the nearest analogy I can think of is meteorological forecasting, looking at the way in which that's developed over the years, from having a few weather balloons and a few observers looking at the horizon, scanning, looking at cloud formations, and trying to predict what's going to happen over the next day, to systems now where we have hundreds of thousands of observations coming in every second from all parts of the globe, including our weather satellites. And we have very complex models that allow us to put all this information together so that we can make reasonable predictions of atmospheric conditions now over certainly a 5-day period, some would argue, now as far as 2 weeks ahead. We can't do that for our cities, but that's a very good, and I think a good aim that we should have in mind. We need to be able to connect data networks, and for that we'll need to have what I call legal and ethical pathways to data access and sharing. That's vital. It has to be seen, we have to be seen to be doing the right thing, using other people's data and data about people in ways which they perceive of as being for their benefit and well-being. For that, we need data standardization and harmonization, and critically, data analytic skills and powerful computational facilities. And that's really where our 3 speakers come in. We've got Jim McCabe, sorry, misspelled your name there, from ANSI, Joel Gurin from NYU GovLab, and Jeff Mulligan from NIST. At the end of this morning, we'll be considering next steps from both of these panels, but I'd like you to bear this point in mind. I think it's important that we should come up with recommendations to improve the regulatory and policy framework for public and private investment in what we call US-EU collaborative science of cities. So with that, I'd like to invite my next panelist to come up, Jim McCabe.
Thank you, Peter, and NYU CUSP for inviting ANSI to speak at this event. I didn't see a program guide. So just those of you who aren't familiar with ANSI, we're a 501c3 nonprofit membership organization that coordinates the U.S. private sector system of voluntary standardization. And it's a system that is relied on heavily by the federal government in particular, but governments at all levels for both regulatory purposes and for procurement. What I'm going to talk about this morning is kind of building on the themes that Peter introduced. I'm going to talk about the economic value of urban data in terms of what's been happening in the realm of international standardization in the area of smart cities. And it's really smart, sustainable, and resilient seem to be the buzzwords. So I'm going to begin by stepping back a little bit. A lot of this is some basic stuff, but I think, again, the idea of sort of building on some of these themes. What do we mean when we talk about a smart city? Well, it uses information and communications technology to increase or improve livability, workability, and sustainability. And this is really all about data. It's about collecting data, using sensors and other systems, communicating that data over networks, and then analyzing the data to understand what's happening and what can be improved. This is from the Smart Cities Council. They released a readiness guide at the end of last year, and that's how they define it. What are the drivers of this movement? Growing urbanization. We've heard the WHO has predicted 70% of the population of the world are going to be living in urban areas by 2050. Most of that's going to happen in developing countries. Most countries or cities are not equipped to that, so it places increasing stress on the already, in many cases, not well-established infrastructure or crumbling infrastructure. I think the American Society for Civil Engineers gave the United States a grade of D+ last year when it was evaluating our overall infrastructure. There is economic competition between cities in terms of where citizens want to locate, in terms of where businesses want to locate. There's growing expectations on the part of citizens and businesses in terms of the ability to interface with government, to have access to data, and to be able to take advantage of some of the technological capabilities that have come out within the last number of years. Growing environmental challenges, certainly climate change. There's the lessons learned from Superstorm Sandy here in our backyard. And again, the growing availability and affordability of smart technologies, whether it's smartphones, smart meters, intelligent transport systems, building energy management systems. All of these are sort of coalescing to kind of drive this movement towards smart cities. So the Smart Cities Council defines the framework for making cities smarter as aligning the responsibilities or the services that cities deliver with the technology enablers that have become available. You see on the slide the different vertical sectors, the built environment, energy, telecom, transport, and so on, which are all the basic areas we're familiar with. And then the enablers are all of the sort of technology components and aspects that need to be considered in terms of a city operating kind of holistically where systems are talking to each other and improving things because they're better integrated. So what does this have to do with standards? Well, we at ANSI, we like to refer to this Department of Commerce estimate, actually goes back to 2004, but that 80% of global commodity trade is impacted by standards and conformity to standards. Who writes standards? Well, by and large, it's private industry. There is government, there are consumers, there are other stakeholders who are involved, but companies use standards to access markets in a global economy, cross-border trade. It helps them to get early entry to markets. It helps reduce their costs and results in increased efficiencies. And government agencies, the federal government in the United States under the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, NOMB Circular A119, is required wherever possible to rely on standards developed by the private sector for regulatory and procurement purposes. And this adjunct sort of voluntary system that exists benefits public health, safety, and the environment, and also contributes to fostering innovation. So what we've seen in basically the last year and a half, 2 years, is this kind of surge of activity in the area of smart and sustainable cities. In 2012, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, it's a non-treaty organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, comprises something like 160 countries around the globe. It established a technical committee 268 on sustainable development in communities. And then just this past year, both ISO, its counterpart organization, the International Electrotechnical Commission, along with the International Telecommunication Union, and a joint committee on information technology, JTC1, between ISO and IEC, all have formed new strategic groups to look at what existing standards there are and what new standards might be needed to achieve this vision of smart and sustainable cities. So on top of that, there are also activities at both the regional level in Europe and national standards bodies, sort of ANSI's counterparts in other countries, particularly in Asia as well, that have or are in the process of developing some sort of a strategic approach to address this whole area. In many cases, that's supported by the government. So where does ANSI fit in? Well, ANSI is the U.S. member of ISO. We're also, through our U.S. National Committee, we're the U.S. member of IEC, and we administer the International Secretariat for the JTC1 Committee. Last November, we held a workshop in Washington to kind of look at this flurry of activity and talk about U.S. coordination and engagement in this activities. What are the stakeholder needs here in the United States? The workshop also identified a number of priority areas for things that could be standardized, including a common lexicon across sectors, common data formats and communication protocols, again, recognizing that cities are complex systems of systems, and if you're going to have interoperability, the data needs to be able to be communicated. Key performance indicators so that cities can compare how they are performing against other cities. Obviously, best practices and, again, resiliency for disaster prevention and recovery. Right now, we're in the process of exploring a collaborative that would essentially promote standards and conformance solutions to the issues that cities are facing. So the first thing that's being looked at is there's a lot of existing standardization in the ICT area. So it's sort of looking at that and saying, well, how does this fit in with this new vision of smart cities? So there's currently activity on sensor networks, on telecom, and how information is exchanged between systems, systems engineering, how are graphical images displayed, the whole area of security, how is data coded and captured, and cloud computing. So all of these areas, again, there's a whole slew of standards that are out there that relate to this stuff, but how does it kind of, in the idea of a holistic approach in a smart city, how will that be accomplished? And then sort of in new areas, there's a number of things that have sort of been put on the table. And again, all of this stuff is really just kind of in the process of getting underway. So you're talking, again, terminology, reference models and architectures. What are the indicators in terms of IT capabilities that cities, that should be developed in terms of having common IT indicators across cities? So this sort of having a unified data approach for the entities, the different agencies that would be involved in a city, and how all of those services are kind of, again, sort of fused in a holistic way. How the IT technologies are applied, a method for smart cities planning and design. And certainly, last but not least, you have to have validation use cases, right? And there are any number of these, but maybe not a standard, but a technical report or some sort of guide that's issued that talks about, well, this city is using or working with, an IT vendor to accomplish a goal in a certain way. That's really important, I think, in terms of advancing this. So kind of stepping outside of the ICT arena, the first standard that's going to be published it has to do with urban indicators, and it was one that was developed by the Global City Indicators Facility, and it includes a set of indicators and a methodology where cities can rate their performance. And I guess it's currently being reported on by some 250 cities across 80 countries across the globe. That's the GCIF version. They basically decided that by bringing it to ISO, they could increase those numbers and get greater exposure and buy-in. So this is kind of my last slide, and I just want to put it out there to kind of, again, get the juices flowing in terms of the themes idea. These are some of the sample core indicators in the ISO 37120 standard. The themes are listed there on the left, and there are also supporting indicators that back these up as well, and a methodology, as I said. But when you look at these, it's pretty clear, I would hope, that they would inform us, whether it's a citizen or a business, in terms of a desirability of, say, New York as a location to do business in or to live in. And I sort of developed this slide with I would say, kind of a developed country slant. But in the ISO standard, it's important to note, too, that a number of these indicators address really kind of very fundamental issues for developing countries. Things like, is potable water available? Is there basic sanitation? Are people living in poverty and slums? So it really is kind of a universal benchmark of kind of indicators. So I think I'll leave it with that and welcome any questions when we get to that point.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I think that's fascinating to see the work that's going on at the American National Standards Institute. Our next speaker is Joel Gurin. So, Joel.
I'm Joel Gurin. I'm a senior advisor at the GovLab, which is also an NYU enterprise run out of the Wagner School of Public Service. And I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we're doing on the ways that public data, including city data, can now be applied for commercial use, for economic growth, for job creation, on a very different kind of level. I think a lot of, what Jim just talked about or what we're going to be talking about today is really the use of urban data for economic development on a large scale. How do we make the city of New York or another city really become a great home for business, a place that really has the infrastructure to support all kinds of industries. What we're looking at is a more kind of granular approach, but hopefully a helpful one. We're looking at companies that are launched very specifically by using data about cities or other kinds of public data to create their business. So examples would be, and I'll get into this in a lot more detail, but examples would include companies that use transportation data to develop an app that tells people when the next bus is coming, which is sort of a classic one, or companies that use different kinds of data about businesses or hospitality businesses within a city to create apps for tourism and so forth. I'll show you a number of examples. I'll also show you the project that we're doing now to really try to bring some rigor to analyzing these. And then I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts which we might discuss later about how standards, both national and international standards, might facilitate the growth of these kinds of companies. Because I think one of the lessons we're seeing is that going to all the trouble of developing one of these apps for a single city is not likely to lead to a very large, viable business. But on the other hand, when it's possible to develop the same kind of application across cities and scale it, you can get something that really is fairly significant. So let me see if I can perform this particular technological task. And beautiful. It works. That's amazing. The goal of the GovLab is to improve the way we govern, to improve and thereby improve people's lives. And we're looking particularly at the interaction of government with both citizens and with business and with the nonprofit sector. So we see three major routes towards improving governance through that lens. One is improving data figuring out how governments can really tap tap expert networks and other kinds of public input in ways that really can kind of improve how they operate. Second is getting data out, the publication of open data, which is the area that I focus on the most. And then the third is what we would call devolved governance or shared governance, ways in which city governments, for example, can take responsibilities that have traditionally been centralized governmental responsibilities and give the community more responsibility for them. Participatory budgeting here, now active in 1,500 cities, would be the kind of paradigm example where a government will take a portion, although mostly a fairly small portion of the budget, give it to a community group and basically say, you figure out how to spend this. So the part that our work on data and economic value stems from is the open data piece. I should say my own background is a combination of publishing, nonprofits, and government. I was the editorial director and then executive vice president of Consumer Reports for many years, and was more recently head of the Consumer Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission, and then also ran a White House task force on smart disclosure, which is what we called the ability of government to get data to consumers in ways that help them make complex decisions in the marketplace. So I've come to the GovLab with a real deep interest in open data. I actually have also just published a book called Open Data Now, available on Amazon. But that's all I'll say. So I, as Beth Novak likes to say, I am kind of running the open data practice at the GovLab, and I'm the director of this project. So let me show you what we're seeing when we look at these open data companies in a kind of granular way, tell you about this project, and then just say a few words about how standards may and a kind of broader view may pertain to this, and then hopefully we can discuss this a bit later. So our idea with the Open Data 500 was we took on a challenge to see, well, let me back up for a minute. There's been a lot of interest, particularly at the federal level in the US, in figuring out how open government data can become a real key business resource for a number of different businesses. Just this last week, a couple days ago, I was down in Washington participating in 2 data paloozas, one on safety, one on education data, which really showcased a number of companies that are now being built using government data on safety, government data on education. There's a health data palooza that's held now every year that I was there last June with over 2,000 people. All of this is run ultimately by Todd Park, the Chief Technology Officer of the U.S., who began in healthcare and is now really trying to promote data liberation across the federal government. We also have an open data policy on the federal level since last May that has essentially mandated that all federal data, with the exception of data that has privacy or security concerns, that federal data in general should be open by default, meaning open in machine-readable formats. Now, given that there are roughly 10,000 federal information systems, and most of them will drive you crazy trying to access them, this is a big task. But what we're doing at the Open Data, with the Open Data 500, is we're trying to figure out what kinds of data sets are most useful so that there can be some prioritization here. I think the difference between, on the federal level, the difference between saying we're looking at 10,000 data sets and let's make them all open overnight, which is kind of undoable, versus saying we've identified 5% of those that have very, very high public value and business value. Let's make those really work first. That, we think, is going to be a more viable kind of approach. Now, what we're studying here is national companies, so it includes both companies that are based on federal data, and it includes companies that are based on city or state data, but that are either have scaled or have credible plans to scale. So a small company that's developed a great little app for the city of Baltimore would not count. On the other hand, one of our companies, which began by working with city data in Palo Alto, has now scaled to about 20 cities, largely in California, but is now on the East Coast as well, would definitely count. And I'm going to show you both how we've got our work. This is a working list of 500. We're inviting public comment. I would really invite all of you to take a look at opendata500.com to get a sense of what we're doing. We are very, very eager for feedback. But I'm going to go to this thing called Full List. This is our current working list of candidates for the Open Data 500. we have some kind of cool visualizations. You can see, you can scroll down, and if I went far enough, you would see all 500 of them. But instead of that, you can do something like click on housing real estate, and it all sorts very nicely. This is one area, and I'll just go through a couple of areas very quickly. This is one area where we're seeing a lot of use of city data. If you look at a company like Trulia, and if you click on these, they expand out. I just sort of love showing that. But if you look at a company like Trulia, they are using both federal data on things like weather, earthquake risk, flood risk, et cetera, and they're using local data on crime, education, walkability. So this is, a major real estate company. Another one is Zillow, which is valued at a couple of $1 billion right now. These are companies that exist because of a combination of federal data, city and state data, and essentially open data that they've been able to use. Now, what's interesting here, among other things, is that when Zillow began, they had to go through all these records of deeds and real estate records and so on, and they basically had to take them out of paper formats and figure out how to digitize them themselves. So the first question is, how does an individual city make it easier for a company to do stuff like that? Well, the first step is to somehow digitize your own records. The second step, though, is how do you make this scalable in a way that Trulia can operate as a real estate company that covers the entire country. So, sorry, I got out of the full list by accident. If you look at the tab here called, whoops, sorry about that. If you look here at a tab called Governance, you'll see there's a number of companies that are particularly working with city data. So here's one called Crime Reports that's looking at crime statistics. Several Govini, based in California, is collecting data on spending at a federal, state, and local level. And a particularly interesting one that's getting a lot of attention now is one called OpenGov. So if you look at OpenGov, and by the way, when this is complete, you'll be able to click on the name and see a whole profile of these companies. We're building, the ones in purple have built out profiles, the ones in different shades of gray are not quite there yet. But OpenGov is a company that began in Palo Alto, and the mayor of Palo Alto has spoken really really praised this company for what they've been able to do in making his data visible. And they began by saying, that city data on budgets is a clear need for public accountability, and in most cities it's virtually unreadable. If you have a town hall meeting, you've got to show an Excel spreadsheet. It's very complex, it's very difficult to understand. And what these guys have done, and I'll actually just click through to their website because that's easy to do. What they've done here is they've created software that makes it very easy for any city to put its budget data on the kind of graph that you could show at a town meeting and have people understand it. So the first level here is, how do we go to the city of Palo Alto and help them communicate with their citizens? The second level, and these are the guys I mentioned who are now in about 20 different cities, the second level is to say, how do we take this platform and apply it to all different kinds of cities so that people can compare, so that Palo Alto, for example, can look at its level of police overtime and compare itself with San Mateo and see if there are similar numbers, and if not, then what does that tell them about the way that they're managing their resources? The third level would be to take this international. And we've come across, even though this study is now of US companies, we've gotten interest. We're going to replicate it in the UK shortly. We're working with the London-based Open Data Institute there. We've gotten interest from about a dozen other countries in having us do the same thing and see how open data may impact economic development in their countries. And I've also seen things like a French company called OpenSoft that's doing similar things in Europe and now wants to come to the US. So the point I would leave you with is that I've just shown you a couple examples. If you go through our website, you'll see many, many more, and they're all sortable both geographically and by sector. But we are seeing a great interest now in using open government data at every level, including the city level, as a key business resource to fuel new businesses. McKinsey and Company recently estimated that the worldwide value of open data is somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion annually. You can argue about those figures a lot, but I think it's fair to say that it is a large number whose potential we are just starting to realize. And the other point is that all of this becomes vastly more economically viable and useful to the degree to which it's scalable, and that standards both nationally and internationally for how we look at things like financial data, crime data, housing data, et cetera, will really facilitate that kind of scalability. And that, I think, is, thinking about commonality of platforms, commonality of standards, really can help accelerate what's becoming an important part of the data-driven economy. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Joel. What I take from that is the fact that a lot of this work on the scalability, the portability, the accessibility of these sorts of developments relates to cities and what's going on within cities. So our final speaker this morning, and I've just blanked for a moment here. Sorry, Jeff Mulligan.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Even though I'm from DC, I'm not a politician, so I actually have no real prepared remarks. I don't have a great slide, but I will try to be technology here and see if I can bring up. See if this works. Okay, so there. Again, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about data and city data, urban data, and how it can be used. The current estimates by 2020, people are talking about 50 billion connected sensor devices connected to the internet and collecting data all over the place. I think the idea of a data, I think Declan mentioned a data-free trade zone. It's an interesting idea. But as you also mentioned, it's a greenfield. We don't have policy. We don't have an understanding of the interaction of privacy between different privacy rules from different organizations, different countries, different areas. How does one privacy policy interact with someone else's privacy policy? There's no alignment there. So I think that becomes very important if we're going to have the ability to trade data. One I do want to mention, Joel mentioned Todd Park. Todd Park brought Sakwu Ri and I into the U.S. government to work as Presidential Innovation Fellows to create innovation within the U.S. government. We launched a project recently called the Smart America Challenge. The goal of that is to get a better understanding of what cyber-physical systems are. Has anybody, raise your hand if you've heard of cyber-physical systems. Okay, now raise your hand if you've heard of the Internet of Things. Okay, so the difference between cyber-physical systems and the Internet of Things is cyber-physical systems are the Internet of Things with a bent on control. Taking what the Internet of Things, which is sensor data, shoving it up into the cloud, doing big data. How many other terms can I put into this thing that we're talking about today? But then turning that around and actually providing control out of that. So controlling streetlights, controlling energy, controlling healthcare, applying real controls to all of that. Our project, it's interesting, I mean, again, that we're talking about smart cities here. When Sakwu and I were brought in, they gave us a big whiteboard, big blank whiteboard and said, go innovate. And in fact, Todd challenged us to grow the GDP by 2 to 3% per year for the next 5 years. That should be simple, right? So we started this whiteboard in Sakwu and I said, cities. Cities are important. Cities are critical for this, the data that's inside cities. We thought about a number of cyber-physical test beds that are spread throughout the US. The government has funded research in this space, basic research over the past 6 years. The fact that a few people raised your hand and had heard about CPS is one thing. The fact that you all didn't raise your hand is what we wanted to get. We want to get the word out about in Smart America. So we were sitting one night thinking, how are we going to grow the GDP? And we said, let's focus on cities. Let's focus on data in cities. Let's bring all of this together. The problem, and we thought, let's go buy a city. Detroit's really cheap right now. But then at the end of the day, we thought we'd own Detroit. So maybe that wasn't a good idea. So we backed off and said, let's talk about a virtual city and the infrastructure and all of the things that were talked about earlier about the idea that virtual cities are networks. And a network of things. And we thought, could we combine this together in a project and show what's possible? What's the data? What's important out of that? What are the interconnections that can be made to show this off? So we launched the project. I'm proud to say we have major corporations like GE, Intel, IBM, AT&T, Schneider Electric, who are all participating, coming together, trying to figure out how can we have these things interact and work together. But the point is, we don't need a set of new protocols to make this work. We don't need a new internet to make it work. What we need to do is have some standardization. Sako and I are working for the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, NIST, understanding higher layers. We have a great internet. We have the plumbing. What we need to understand is, how can these things interconnect? How does a smart energy system communicate intelligently with a transportation system in some meaningful way that they do something, that something's useful, that benefits economically, benefits safety, benefits efficiency-wise for U.S. citizens and the U.S. Again, yeah, Peter mentioned that cities are networks, and that's why we decided in Smart America to not just focus on smart cities, but to find out how that interaction can be made more efficient and can add huge value and at the end of the day, hopefully grow the GDP. I did try to figure out why, why am I, on this panel? I'm not an economist. I don't know. And then I realized, well, since Sean Kelly couldn't be here, maybe you just needed another Irishman or something. Then talking this morning, some people said they played golf, and I realized, no, it was just because you wanted to be able to take a mulligan. But then since you spelled my name wrong, you already took the mulligan. So sorry about that. To get back to it, though, I think that it's important that we understand about data trade and the privacy concerns associated with that. Understanding who owns the data when it's created. Is it the person who the data is collected on? Is the person who spent all of the money to collect the data? Is it is it the cloud where it happens to sit? I think that it's important for us to understand and start this policy debate because I guess if you sort of think about it, if data is created and can't be traded, is it of any value? And so with that, I will turn it over and with our panel so that we can maybe talk through some of these questions. Thank you.
We've got time, at least 20 minutes now, for questions on what you've been hearing this morning. Issues about standardization, issues about open data, open government, and issues I think particularly important from my perspective is about the ownership, the property, intellectual property rights, the ownership, the data controller, the legality, the ethics of doing what we want to do. So with that, no further ado, I'll just open this for questions.
I have my guess about the stuff that you talked about is that there's a sort of relationship that the bigger the city, the less likely they are to want to be open about their data. And but that's just my guess, and I wonder if you could correct me on that or tell me if that's accurate, or sort of what that relationship between size and openness is in your experience.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not actually sure there is one. I mean, a lot of the innovators have been New York, Chicago, San Francisco, major cities. And yet at the same time, you've had a city like Palo Alto or I'm forgetting the name, but there are cities all over the country, small cities that have just decided to innovate in this way. So I think it really has had so far much more to do with the particular leadership of that particular place, and whether there's a mayor or a community that's really inspired to do it. I would say, though, that the limiting factor has been the technical difficulty of taking city records and putting them in a really digitized, easy to use, easy to analyze kind of form. And that's why companies like OpenGov or many others now are trying to make that simpler. And I think what will actually happen is it'll make it easier for small cities to get over that kind of technical challenge that some of the larger cities may have actually had more resources to deal with in the past.
I'm Andrea Moore. I'm from the New York City Economic Development Corporation, the research group there. I forget who, but the McKinsey stat about the 3 to 5 trillion, which is a wide range. Has there been any progress on estimating the economic impact of open data on individual cities as a way to perhaps make the case to bring leadership along that may be more reluctant to share data? Or is there any effort in the Open Data 500 to quantify how many jobs they've created, or those sort of indicators?
I think we need that, and we don't have it yet. If you look at the McKinsey study, it's looking at a very, and you can see it online if you just Google McKinsey Open Data. It was a study last October. They're at a very, very high level. I was on a panel at the Safety Data Palooza with somebody from McKinsey a couple of days ago, and he said that they're now estimating that it's 3.2 to 5.4 trillion. So at least it's getting more precise. But these are it's still. But these are very, very high level estimates. And I think what they're trying to do and is useful to do is just kind of put a stake in the ground. We're at the exact opposite end of the spectrum. We're looking at a really granular level at the uses of open data by specific companies, but given that we're looking at about 500 of them, we're really hoping that it's going to be possible to analyze what we get from that, et cetera. But I think you're raising a really important question. I'm not aware of any real focused, broad effort to look city by city at the economic value of open data, and it would seem to be the next logical move. So I think that would be a very valuable study for somebody to do.
Can I just add on that I think the City of London Mayor, working with the Open Data Institute in London, that's certainly a goal that he has, which is to put a figure on it. When you get figures like the McKinsey figures, the way I interpret those is just to say, well, okay, the benefits are big and positive, but at the actual number, we're not sure about. The value in doing that kind of cost-benefit analysis is it does actually cause people to think about who benefits and how, and who might lose in this issue as well. I think it's a useful exercise, even though, quite honestly, the numbers themselves are often questionable.
Hi, my name is Trish Culligan. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Data Science and Engineering at Columbia University, and my question is for James. I'd be interested to know what progress has been made to review data sets before given over to open access. And I think as we move into an era where data is knowledge, I think we've got to be a little bit careful about putting out data sets that sort of haven't had a second look at them. And I'm drawing an analogy with the academic world here where we create new knowledge. There is some sort of peer review system that we go through before that knowledge is published and made openly available.
Well, from the standards perspective, I mean, what standards are based on consensus, right? And they're open, so anybody can come to the table and have their views expressed and incorporated. So the standards community would, in developing a standard, would provide basically a baseline for what the data sets might be, just like in the urban indicator standard I mentioned, where there's sort of a methodology underneath that, like when you're reporting on this particular indicator, you're looking at XYZ. So then, but in particular cases, in terms of implementation, I mean, that's ultimately going to be up to the municipality in question, I would think.
Good question at the front here.
So those of us who write for a living have a common quip that the second most basic human urge is to edit somebody else's text. But after 2 years of trying to build CUSP, of which we'll talk more in the second panel, I'm beginning to think that there's an even more basic human urge, and that is to hoard data. In large governments, the silos favor the hoarding of data because it's turf, it's power, it is avoidance of embarrassment, or what the data might reveal. In the private sector, it's the data has perhaps differential advantage for a company, or it can be monetized. And even in academia, people hoard data. And the question is, how do we promote the kind of things that you're all talking about against that basic organizational fact?
Well, from the administration's point of view, the president demanded it.
So there's a Shakespeare line, right? I can call spirits from the vasty deep. Why, so can any man, but will they come when you call them? Right?
But I think
the federal government.
right. I mean, I understand, but I think we have seen, at least in the federal government side, the openness and the opening of data, and through, as Joel mentioned, safety data palooza, health data palooza, and all of those, a huge opening of the hordes of data that the American public owns, that has been created, and an amazing number of companies launched, and an economic benefit generated from that.
Yeah, I agree with that, but with a caveat. And I mentioned that I chaired the White House Task Force on Smart Disclosure. In that role, I got to talk to data officers at probably about 25 different federal agencies, most of whom I think were interested in doing this. But I would say there's a tremendous variability between federal agencies. So you have agencies like the EPA, Health and Human Services, Department of Transportation, some others that have really been leaders, and you have a number of agencies that would just rather this all go away. I think, to be blunt, public embarrassment is a pretty good tool. And what we're finding, I didn't mention this actually, but I really want to stress this, and I think it also comes back to the question of economic value. One of the most important things we're doing in the Open Data 500 is we don't just want to list these companies. That's just a first step. We are asking every single company, please tell us what data sets you use, rate their usefulness on a scale of 1 to 4, and tell us either what's right with them or what's wrong with them. And we've begun to talk to people in the federal government and say, you know, we really want to bring this back to you and meet with your data officers in these agencies and either tell them, you know, this is great, or tell them, as one person who will remain anonymous said, you know, one reviewer said, their data set is, capital letters, so bad. So I think as open data becomes more of a kind of concept that's widely accepted, the pressure to show data will lead to improvements in the data. But the other thing that I just want to stress is that I think prioritization is incredibly important. And I think we have to get somewhere between what people have called data hugging disorder, for which there is no apparent cure, and the mandate, which I totally agree with in principle, but I think is pretty unworkable, that all 10,000 federal information systems are now going to become open. Not all that data is equally useful. And what we hope to do through the Open Data 500 is to begin to provide information that can start a dialogue, not just on your data set is so bad, make it better, but on these are the 5 data sets we really need. And can we figure out how to make those open and useful? And then I think there's a real chance of getting past what have been, you know, what has been a lot of resistance to releasing data.
Well, I would just, building on what Joel just said, I mean, I think it's an idea whose time has come, right? So with programs like the one he's running, and what we've seen in different agencies, I think you're going to see less of that when they see the value, the integration, especially when they're making procurement decisions and wanting to pick a particular IT vendor, like which, you know, they're going to want to leverage the data that they have to improve things. So.
And real quickly, again, to follow up, the President's Innovation Fellow Program, the agencies across the U.S. compete for folks to come in and open their data. And it's amazing to see folks like DOJ, that, you know, Department of Justice, you wouldn't necessarily think was going to be, you know, and driving. They just announced a challenge to $150,000 challenge to open their data up and to watch the competition from these government agencies to come in and find someone to grab their data and make it available. It's phenomenal. Or as Todd would say, it's awesome.
Can I just add to that the role that the scientific community must play in this strategy for openness? There was a very good report that came out from the UK Royal Society, which is the UK's oldest and I think most prestigious scientific institution. And it was published last year. It's called Science as an Open Enterprise. It's a big report, and it was stimulated by a very unfortunate set of events which was termed ClimateGate in the UK, which was about data hugging by climate scientists and a lack of sharing of data. If science is to progress, if urban science is to progress, replicability of those research findings is absolutely important, and replication requires data sharing and openness. And that's where the scientific community can push, and there are problems, obviously, particularly where data relate to living persons, identifiable organizations. But there are ways nowadays, technical ways particularly, of sharing such data, which does not reveal identities, but makes available the power of those data for innovative data systems.
I'm Jim Vogel, and I'm with the New York State Senate. Try not to laugh. With all the talk about data, one of the things that I haven't heard any standardization on is on analytic lensing. I mean, we're all familiar with GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So we can have infinite amounts of data, we can standardize it all we want, but until we have standardizations on interpretation and analysis, we're just going to be cyber spin doctors. Has there been any discussion about this?
That's a tough question. What you're saying essentially is that if we just work from a data perspective, data dredging, data mining or whatever, then we are in danger of garbage in, garbage out. What we need, of course, are research hypotheses, research ideas, research issues that we are pursuing that will enable us to sort the wheat from the chaff, to pick out the 1% of data in the 99% that's got value. And it's this idea of finding the intelligence within data, which is critically important. And that's what prevents the garbage in, garbage out. So from my answer to your question is that this must be science-driven, and it must be issues-driven, it must be policy-driven. And that I think, helps us to address this very important issue. But again, there's a lot of trial and error involved here.
I will mention that NIST does have a project and a program on big data. I don't know all the details of it, but I do believe portions of that are looking at this, and also looking at how do you take big data and ensure, I think the question was, the peer review of data. I think part of my hope is like mushrooms don't grow in sunlight. I think the exposure of the data, hopefully bad data shrivels and goes away. But there are at least some programs that are trying to look at this, and how do you take the transformation of data and turn it into information in an actual valuable way.
So I was just going to add, one of the other standards being developed by the committee that developed the Urban Indicators standard is a management system approach. You probably may be familiar with the ISO 9000 standard for quality management, basically letting manufacturing processes be consistent and repeatable. So they're looking at that in the context of this smart city idea. So it's quite possible there may be discussion of what you're talking about in that.
Mike Holland, CUSP. One question. So standards, there are sort of like different times at which standards matter. And some, as products are coming to market, there's a set of standards there that are very important. But in early stages of things, standards can actually facilitate research and facilitate development of things. Given the wide variety of activities that were mentioned in the presentations, can you talk about what where we are in that stage? Do we need greater level of activity? Are we Is it prudent to wait a little while? What can, some commentary on that timing at this stage would be helpful.
One quote I absolutely love, Donald Knuth, professor of computer science out of Stanford, said, "Early optimization is the root of all evil." And I think what he meant by that is a lot of times we jump to nothing. I love ANSI, the work that we do, but a lot of times we do jump too early to try to standardize, create new protocols without really understanding that maybe we've got what we need today. And that's part of what, Saku and I, our proposition for Smart America is we have what we need as the underlying underpinnings to interconnect these things. Could we make it better? Absolutely. But we don't need to wait for that. We don't need to wait for the next best sliced bread. We can use what we have today. We can make great toast, whatever metaphor you want to use, and press on and start to get this transformation of city data into city information that makes it useful for folks. So standards are critical. Right? We wouldn't have the internet today. We wouldn't have all that we have, whether you like Facebook or YouTube. It wouldn't be there if we didn't have a set of standards, and that's really important. But we don't want to work. We don't want the development of the standards to get in the way of the evolution of the capabilities of the data. So it's not really an answer directly to your question. To get back to it, I think the timing, we need to find out where the gaps are. We need to find out where to apply the pressure. We need to do some experimentation. We need to try things out. And then as we start to understand that, ANSI, IEEE, IEC, however many other letters we can stick together, then can standardize, and the scientists can come together, the engineers can come together, and then figure that out without everybody trying to throw everything in the kitchen sink. And getting standard by committee is probably not the right way to go.
So, I think the timing is what it is, right? There's been this incredible momentum over the last couple of years to look at this, and the analysis of what currently exists and how that can be leveraged rather than creating something new is the first thing that folks are doing. Basically, the three organizations, and that's really the issue, is there may be overlap and duplication. We always talk about conservation of resources. Well, that's probably, there's going to be some of that, but at least you have more minds working to solve the problem. But, anybody can participate. It's the beauty of this process. It's an open process, so academia is welcome at the table, government, and so on. And it's happening. It's really, this is a good stage to get involved if you haven't been involved and you want to contribute to that sort of consensus development of, having a benchmark.
Andre Rukenstein. I'm at Boston University, at Lancaster University right now. It seems to me really that the future of this field and the great benefit of this field will ultimately be using these idea and model-driven questions and collecting the right kind of data, and that from the general public, from institutions, from municipalities, and so on. So there is a piece of this where the community at large needs to be educated, and a new culture needs to be somehow forged in this whole process. And it seems to me that that is a critical aspect of sort of really leveraging the true power of what we have in front of us. Where are these institutional approaches? Obviously you could imagine doing the same thing institutionally. Because in the end, you're going to want to not simply use existing data, but really collect the right kind of data that will truly make a difference. Can you comment a bit on this aspect and particularly educating the public about the importance of the discussions we're having?
I would just say, I think in the tech community particularly, and in sort of civil society organizations, there's a lot of growing interest and understanding of the importance of city data, of other kinds of open data. I think we haven't had the right feedback loops. I think, is really a large part of the problem. You know, and if you look at, I'm just talking at the national level, if you look at other countries, the UK, when they launched their open data program, set up an open data users group to give feedback to the government. France and Mexico are now really launching major open data programs, beginning by asking potential users what they're going to want to see. We have not had that in this country in any kind of formalized or even semi-formal way. I think if we begin to institute those kinds of feedback opportunities at the federal, the state, at the local level, I think we're going to find that there are a lot of people out there who are already really interested and really have some very creative ideas and feasible ideas about how to use the data, but they need to talk to the data holders in order to get that loop really working.
I mean, I would just add that, you know, there's no shortage of NGO initiatives. You know, I mentioned Smart Cities Council, Global Cities Institute, there's Star Communities is another one. I mean, it seems like every day there's a new initiative, and a lot of them have very good support systems behind them. So I think as knowledge of those becomes more pervasive through social media and what have you, people will sort of get the message. You know, maybe more can be done in a centralized way at the government level, but, you know, I think that's kind of maybe a difference between the US and the EU in terms of how things sort of evolve in getting the word out.
I think educating folks to the benefits of the data, right? I think that there's a lot of disdain and concern about the collection of data, because I think, at least from an American point of view, we think we're just going to be sold more baby diapers. And as opposed to what's the real value, what's the benefit that's going to come back, and not just try to sell me something else, but instead make my life better and through that data. And so I think educating the American populace, educating the world populace that there are just some great things that are going to come out of this by actually showing experiential, showing it off and showing how these things really do impact, make our life better, make our commute better. You know, how many people use Waze? I mean, it's an amazing tool. I can imagine how much data it's collecting, but I allow it to do it because it gets me to my destination faster. So that's okay.
I think I'd just add for that, if you were to ask me, what's the occupational area that's growing most rapidly at the moment? What's the occupation that's seeing annual wages rising rapidly, annual incomes rising rapidly? Well, what's the occupational area where across the world we're experiencing skill shortages? And it's simple, it's data analytics. And this is becoming the sexy occupation of the future. And this is where organizations like NYU and CUSP have really got a role to play in terms of getting those educational programs out there, getting the top people into those programs. And I think what we've seen this morning from the three presentations from our panelists is that there's a tremendous amount of work going on. And the real task now is to pull that together, to coordinate, and to extract the very best from all of these different initiatives that are taking place. This, I think, is a major role that CUSP and its international partners can play. I'd like to thank the three panelists this morning very much for their presentations. I thought that was really fascinating stuff, and I think that set us up for the rest of the morning today. So please say your thanks to them too.